Good morning. My name is Earthren Cousin, and I am a distinguished fellow in the Center on Global Food Security and Agriculture here at the Council on the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us this morning, and especially to our members who are joining us via Zoom for today's On the Record program in honor of International Women's Day. If you'd like to submit a question to today's panel, please visit ccga.live. And we'll use those questions to include in this robust conversation that we'll have with our great panel today. As a reminder, the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. The Council is convening today's timely discussion in honor of International Women's Day. The pandemic has disproportionately impacted women across the globe, deepened inequalities, and exposed the vulnerabilities within political, economic, health, and security systems. The crisis is yet another example and another reminder of the importance of women's participation to ensuring our recovery from not only this pandemic, but our ability to achieve a more gender equal world. Today, with our distinguished panel, we will discuss the meaning of a feminist foreign policy and how, or could, or would, adopting a feminist foreign policy create a more gender equal world. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speakers. Let's start with Dr. Gary Barker. Dr. Barker serves as the CEO and founder of Promundo, where he has worked for 20 years in more than 40 countries, engaging men and boys with an agenda of advancing gender equality. We next are joined by Ambassador Delphine O. Ambassador O leads the Generation Equality Forum. The Generation Equality Forum will arguably be the largest and most important international gathering on gender equality and women's rights since the 1995 Beijing Conference. The forum is scheduled to convene this June in France. Finally, we're joined by Professor Lyric Thompson. Professor Thompson serves as the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Center for Research on Women, ICRW. And she also serves as an adjunct professor at the George Washington University, where Professor Thompson teaches a graduate level course on women's rights and advocacy. Thank you to each of you for joining us today. So let's just get right into it. In 2014, Sweden adopted the first explicitly feminist foreign policy with an objective of promoting women's rights, equitable representation of women in decision-making, and fair allocation of resources for women. Other countries such as France, Canada, and Spain have implemented similar strategies to advance women's rights through foreign policy priority setting. Is there an agreed definition of what is a feminist foreign policy? And what does a feminist foreign policy mean for each of you? And give an example of the impact of adopting a more feminist foreign policy. What's the positive impact on adopting a more feminist foreign policy? Let's start with you, Delphine, if we may, with the definition.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Chicago Council for organizing this event on a very timely subject, especially on the occasion of International Women's Day. Hello to my co-panelists. Hi, Mr. Barker, and hi to Lyric, who's a very good friend. We've been working together for quite some time. So as you noticed, Sweden is not the first country to have adopted a feminist foreign policy. Since then, actually, I would add to your list not only Canada, France, and Spain, but also Mexico and Luxembourg. So far, we have 6 countries in the world, both in the global north and in global south, to have adopted feminist foreign policies. And we hope to have many more in the coming months and coming years, based on the work that those countries are doing, but also that institutions such as ICWRW are working. So there is no, which is interesting, is that there is no single definition of feminist foreign policy. Sweden has published its Swedish Handbook for Feminist Foreign Policy. Canada is coming up very soon with a paper on Canadian feminist foreign policy. We ourselves in France, we don't have actually a theoretical framework for what is our feminist foreign policy, what is our definition. I do have my own definition though, if it may be of interest. And really my own definition is to put gender and the gender equality lens at the center of everything that you do when you do foreign policy, to make it so cross-cutting, so transversal, that it becomes inevitable in any decision that is being taken at any level, either low, middle, or high management, when you are making foreign policy, which is also true actually about domestic policy, but that's also another issue. And that's what we try to do also in France, even though our feminist foreign policy is more recent than Sweden and Canada, and I'm not saying that we have completely been successful until now, but it's a work in progress, is to make sure that, you know, bit by bit, step by step, every decision that is being made by any person at any level, either in Paris or in our huge diplomatic network, has to almost unconsciously integrate the gender angle and the women's rights angle when they make this decision.
So I turn to our other panelists. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, or even more importantly for our audience, give us an example of the difference putting women at the center of foreign policy could or would make in how foreign policies are prioritized or implemented?
If you don't mind, I'd love to just add a few things to Delphine's definition, because that was our first step in this process as a research institute, was looking across all of the various countries that have penned or announced feminist foreign policies to see what commonalities, what differences. And it really struck us that there wasn't a definition, as Delphine said. And we felt that if this was going to be a successful field, there needed to be a little bit more precision around that. So in consultation with the countries that Delphine has named, as well as more than 200 organizations, including Gary's, who is, I think, very well placed to talk to you about examples and impact. But we did want to add a few things. So the Swedish approach gave us a handy mnemonic device, rights, resources, representation, which is to say they would focus on women's rights in their bilateral and multilateral strategic dialogues. They would have more women doing the art and science of foreign policy in their apparatus, and very importantly, that they would increase resourcing to that end. Most of the other countries have followed pieces of that, and I think one of the success factors in terms of measurable impact is being able to track increasing resourcing for this. For donor countries, the handiest tool that we have for that is the OECD DAC gender marker. Mm-hmm. And so Sweden has always been around 90% of its ODA for gender as a principal or significant goal. Canada and France have both set specific goals. France, I think, to get to 50% by next year, and Canada to get to 95% by, I think, also next year. So that, I think, is a nice illustrative example. But for us, and for feminists in civil society and feminists on the receiving end of these policies, it's very important that this not just be about some women, but take more of a power-based lens that says, how does a feminist foreign policy not just look at gender, but also race and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, immigration status, sexual orientation, all of these different ways in which disability power gets manifested unequally and really acknowledge that foreign policy's legacy has, particularly for some of the global North, been a tool of advancing power, of acquiring additional resources. It has been colonial, it has been racist, it has been sexist. So our definition attempted to build some of those intersections into the lens, say the co-equal goals of global goods like peace, people, not just women, and planet, particularly in the climate crisis. Our final success factor for this, I think, is the importance of that being co-created with feminists who are on the receiving ends of these policies and being implemented at home and abroad. For the United States, for example, we haven't ratified CEDAW, we don't have paid leave. It's very hollow if we're prancing about the world stage, preaching these values without working on that at home. So I'd love to turn it to Gary to talk a little bit about impact and what that looks like when it's done well.
Gary.
Yeah, I guess just adding to that, I think I think I absolutely agree, Lyric, with the, what needs to be in a full foreign policy, feminist foreign policy package. And I do think, I think the crucial point that all three of us seem to be agreeing on is it's going beyond what some of the previous work has done, which is important to say how many women are at the table when such policy decisions are made, to go far beyond that. Obviously, representation in numbers and having an adequate number of women at the table is a key piece of that. But I think the key words that many of us are believing in here are power and privilege and systems and structures. That we're not just talking about, yes, we need to measure how much aid goes from wealthier countries to poorer countries. And I think, Lyric, your point on decentering the role of global North organizations in administering that money and deciding where it goes. I think a lot of the US aid apparatus has been about measuring project impact rather in the lives of women and girls, which is important, obviously, but doesn't get to those broader systems and structures and a voice, which I think is so important as well. If I think about the issue of where male allyship, and that's what I focus on in this space, if I think where it is, I think a lot of the discussion of men as allies for gender equality, it's often also been superficial. This idea of having a few men come in the room as champions of the cause without really getting into deeper issues of power and privilege. And so I do think, as I have looked at some of and we've been partners with the Swedish government in a number of occasions, looking at what they mean for a fuller feminist foreign policy, it also echoes what Lyric said about, do we look at what we're doing at home well? Whether it's paid leave, economic security for the poorest women and families, ending violence of all kinds by men against women, meaningful efforts to engage men and boys as allies in that beyond, as I said before, this idea of champions. So I think that's really what I would hold up. And I think, I think Lyric touched on how it connects to post-conflict and peace issues. I think it also ties to climate issues. I think it requires us to look at that. We know that in many parts of the world, it is men who are less likely to say they would take or are willing to make changes in their lifestyles to take account to our impact on the planet, and yet it is women who feel the impact the most. So to me, it connects up to power, privilege, to poverty, to climate issues, and to peace and security issues.
So using rights, resources, representation for people, peace, planet, and inclusively ensuring that power is and privilege are equitably distributed. I think we're getting there on the definition. So let me come over to you, Delphine, if you don't mind, to talk about the Gender Equality Forum, which is, I understand, a multilateral effort with the goal of securing commitments to advancing towards achieving gender equality. Okay, with prioritizing, how will, or if it will, prioritizing of feminist foreign policy contribute to achieving the objectives of the Generation Equality Forum? And if it will, how? And alternatively, how are you bringing together countries at the Generation Equality Forum to develop a shared set of commitments?
Thank you. Well, actually, I'm going to kind of take your question reversely. I'm going to say that the Generation Equality Forum itself is already a manifestation and expression of feminist foreign policy as it was adopted by France less than 2 years ago. So as I said, we came after Sweden and Canada, and President Macron said that we are going to adopt a feminist foreign policy that came with a number of commitments. I'm not going to list all of the commitments, but one of them is actually to propose to UN Women, which is the convener of this international conference, which hasn't taken place in the past 25 years, actually 26 years in 2021. Can you imagine that we would go without a COP for 26 years, or without a major, nuclear security council summit within 26 years? Well, we've been going without a major international women's rights or gender equality conference for the past 26 years. So President Macron actually proposed to UN Women that France would co-chair and co-host this very important international gathering together with Mexico. So this is already a manifestation of our feminist foreign policy, together with the fact that we've decided, whenever France is either the pen holder of a resolution or is chairing any kind of important regional or international organization. For instance, when we were holding the presidency of the G7 in 2019, when we are at the Human Rights Council in Geneva right now, next year we'll have the EU presidency in 2022. We're going to make sure that we talk about women's rights, that this is not a secondary issue. This is actually at the center of what we do and what we promote. But so to come back to the forum, as you said, so this is kind of a unique adventure, a unique enterprise. It's not a UN typical, conventional summit. It's based on voluntary commitments, but it's also based on good competition, I would say. So we don't have a UN mandate. What we have is a multi-stakeholder, huge mobilization of all actors. We have member states. We have, of course, all of the UN. We have many international organizations such as the European Union, the OECD, the African Union, and so on. But we also have, most importantly, civil society. And I'm going back to what Lyric and Gary were saying. What we did is center civil society, and especially feminist movements, in the very conception and organization of this conference. I think it is very much the first time in any area of international relations that two countries, together with the UN agencies, are organizing a conference, and we put civil society at the governance table, not just at the end, at the receiving end, but they're deciding with us. They have a veto power together with us, and without them, we cannot decide anything. So this is kind of revolutionary in the way that you even plan for a conference and decide what are going to be our results, what are going to be our objectives, our goals, what are going to be the commitments that we ask for in the framework of this forum. Then, of course, all of the issues that we'll be tackling in the context of the forum are related to feminist foreign policy, combating gender-based violence, economic empowerment, the nexus of gender and climate, sexual and reproductive health and rights, feminist movements, and so on. And we have one specific issue that we're focusing on, which is feminist movements and leadership. And within the context of this action coalition, we'd like also to promote feminist foreign policy. Of course, it's not up to us as a single government, to give lessons to others and say, well, you should adopt a feminist foreign policy. We have the support of civil society to do that. But we also, together with our other 5 peers, want to act maybe, I wouldn't say as role models, but as, pioneers or countries that are paving the way and showing the rest of the world and other member states that first you can do it. It's not, it's not taboo to have a feminist foreign policy, even the word feminist. And second, this actually really kind of enhances your position in the world. Even if you're a member of the permanent, one of the permanent members of UN Security Council, like France, even doing that enhances your position in the world.
So is your plan for this conference to be virtual, or are you ambitious in holding it in an in-person conference?
Well, I'm happy to announce that the president will actually announce the dates for the Paris Forum no later than this Monday, so for International Women's Day. This has been in the making in the waiting for quite a long time. It will take place at the end of June, and so it will be largely virtual, as you would imagine, because the situation in France so far is not allowing us to hold what we had planned for last year, which was a huge 8,000 large participants, a gathering, joyful and networking and all kinds of festivities. This is not for 2021. I think this is not in the plans for 2021. And if we can, we'll have a small presidential presence. But so far, we're aiming at a huge, a big virtual event.
Fantastic. And so, Gary, I can assume that you and your colleagues will also participate in this conference, because over the last 20 years, you've worked with governments and private stakeholders to engage men and boys in advancing gender equality. And you mentioned this in your opening. We often hear the term and see the buttons, he for she. And it's a little more than sloganeering in many quarters. So, what are the commitments and actions that men and boys must make to advance gender equality? And as we celebrate Women's History Month, men still dominate foreign policy decision-making and priority setting. So to make the changes that we've been talking about so far this morning, how should we discuss and socialize a gender equality agenda in foreign policy with men to ensure that they bring these issues into the center of their thinking in governments and international organizations?
Wow, yeah, that's kind of at the heart of taking down patriarchy, but let's go for it. And I do think that's what the 25 years since Beijing are about. This has to be at that structural level. I think about, if we are honest and about what U.S. foreign policy has been for many years, it has often been power over and not power with. And I think as we, to really get the US government and its foreign policy apparatus to buy into a feminist foreign policy framework is to say that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work at the level of nation states, and it doesn't work in having kind of men's power over women. And so I think we've got to, where I see the, a fantastic promise of this conversation is to say, this is not simply about appointing some more women in voices of power at decision-making levels at the State Department. That's one key piece of it, but this is retooling how we see our place in the world as men and as a country whose foreign policy has often been telling others what to do, sometimes in softer development reasons, but many times in a militaristic way. So I do think this requires us to say, we have to rethink power, and we have to rethink how we make that with, not instead of. And that's the parallel that we try to do with engaging men and boys. This is not men and boys stepping in the room to be now I'm here to talk about feminism with, which is kind of what he for she doesn't mean to do that, but it can often become that of just men sort of step in the room and say, yes, I support women in positions of leadership. And then we step out of the room and nothing has changed in terms of who controls the levers of power. What we're doing and taking to the conversations together with the UN Foundation, and we're part of the NEST Alliance is bringing in two key topics that we see are at the heart of where patriarchy gets reproduced. One is about unpaid care and the care burden. We know that the fact that women continue to do 3 times the amount of household care is probably, if not the single, it's one of the largest reasons women's workforce and income compared to men is less. It is where power is made every day at the household level. So one of the things we're working on is presenting our 4th State of the World's Fathers report on how do we get to a care equal world so that we get to a work and pay equal world. And the other issue that we're bringing, of course, is around violence. We know globally with UN Women's numbers and others that about 1/3 of the world's women have experienced or will experience violence from a male partner. Too much of the work around trying to end that has been also very superficial, one-off campaigns, one-off trainings, really well-intentioned diversity training and sexual harassment training in the workplace that doesn't go beyond that. We think the Biden administration, certainly Biden's previous record shows his willingness to take that issue seriously. We think that's got to be front and center as well in terms of dismantling power that happens in workplaces, in places like the State Department, in our homes every day. So those are the two topics that we're putting our allyship behind. But I go back to the issue of really, and I think the Gender Equality Forum is putting this issue of power central, both of global North power over global South and of men's power over women. How do we redress that beyond the superficial? That's easier to say than to put it into practice, but I think that's the questions you're asking are precisely that. What do we do at the granular level of institutions to make that real? And that's why I'm so looking forward to knowing, what happens next, both at Paris and in Mexico, because I think that's at the level where it gets interesting and real.
So, Lyric, listening to Gary talk about what is necessary from the Biden administration, you, as a member of the Coalition for Feminist Foreign Policy, began an effort to promote a U.S. foreign policy that includes gender equality and a human rights perspective. In fact, your coalition released in 2019 a vision for feminist foreign policy in the U.S. And in 2021, President Biden created a new gender policy council within the White House, and as a part of this administration's commitment to gender equality. But just this week, the administration issued their foreign policy strategic guidelines, and gender is not mentioned. Diversity and inclusion is, to their credit, but gender is not. And so can you speak to some of the policy recommendations and the opportunity for the US government to amend that foreign policy to include more gender equity? And specifically, is there anything that is also required from Congress to support a more gender equitable foreign policy?
Thank you for that question. And I'm delighted to answer it. We've done a lot of work on the Coalition for a Feminist Foreign Policy in the United States to articulate very specific policy recommendations across all streams of foreign policy, so aid and trade, defense, diplomacy, and including immigration policy, because of course we are entering this in the context of our last administration, which I think subverted a number of the goals that we have articulated in our vision, and I'll share that. I've been sharing a few resources in the chat, and I will share the full paper shortly. And my thanks to Gary, who's on the steering committee of that coalition with me, and to Ambassador O for her help and thought leadership in what other countries are doing and what we could recommend for the United States. So yes, we are asking for across, if you want to take the mnemonic device of rights, resources, representation, I think as a research institute, we would add a fourth R on research and accountability. But I think we have very specific asks, several of which the Biden administration is already moving on, including the Gender Policy Council. We called for a feminist foreign policy, or for a feminist policy council, which again would have foreign policy elements as well as the domestic policy elements. So the check mark there, it's based at the White House, and it's an improvement on the last iteration of that council, which was called the White House Council on Women and Girls. So the language has changed. We've gone from women and girls to gender, which signals, I think, a broader aperture, which we like very much. We've also seen that the goal and mandate of that council, which has not been authorized yet, it hasn't been, the executive order authorizing it hasn't happened. It will, but their sort of initial language when they announced the council and the leadership of that council indicated that it would include focus on issues of race and identity, climate, and several of the other sort of intersectional issues that we're calling for. So that's all great. Has senior level leadership, two co-chairs, one of whom is full-time to the council. That's also an improvement. All secretaries of all cabinet agencies participating. That happened last time, but this time there's also participation by the other White House power councils, National Security Council, Domestic Policy Council, National Council of National Economic Council. Those are good things. What we don't know is the extent to which that council will focus on foreign policy. It intends to, and indeed, I believe the director of that council is speaking at a UN Foundation event shortly, so hopefully we'll hear a little bit more about what they will prioritize. And I'm sure we will hear more at the Commission on Status of Women at the United Nations next, in week after next. So that's good stuff in terms of representation. But as Gary said, and this administration also definitely deserves accolades for another element we were calling for, which is gender parity in the foreign policy architecture, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is an administration that has honored that more than any other administration in history, and really is taking the idea of an administration that looks like America very seriously. So that's great. But as Gary said, representation is a visible and measurable element of a feminist foreign policy, but it's not the extent of that. We also want to see representation by those feminists who are on the receiving end of these policies, co-creating goals together. Nothing about us without us. How are these, is the intent of a policy playing out as intended on the ground? Is the intent the right one? Is it responsive to what women's rights and movements are organizing for there? To what level will we see a resourcing of that agenda? We're calling for 20% of overseas development assistance to support gender as a principal goal, which is a large increase over where most donors are at the moment. It hovers around 7%. We want 100% of that. Remember, Canada is shooting for 95, Sweden's around 90. We want 100% of that to include a gender analysis to be supporting gender as a principal or significant goal. That's a major shift. The president's budget request will come out later. We shall see. The rights piece, I think, is essential. And you noted that in Secretary Blinken's 8 strategic priorities that were announced this week, you did not see gender. I am hopeful that that is because key positions for gender and foreign policy have not been filled yet. So namely the Global Women's Issues Ambassador, there's a senior coordinator for gender equality at USAID. And I'm hopeful that they will name similar senior gender people in all of the foreign policy agencies who will be working full-time on that and report directly to the secretary. So we're giving it time. We'll see what they do. But I think there is definitely, there's definitely more we would like to see there. Similarly, we had a number of 100-day asks that they've been very good at achieving, everything from rescission of the global gag rule, which I will say was late. It's usually a day 1 priority, and it was more than a week late. But seeing better language now, there was some questionable language on sexual and reproductive health and rights at the beginning. That's improving again, I think, as they get staff on board. And then, what are they going to announce at the Commission on the Status of Women next week? And we really want to see high-level leadership at the Generation Equality Forum, both Mexico and Paris. I'd love to see the United States make a commitment across all of the 6 action coalitions, but absolutely, Action Coalition 6, Feminist Movements and Leadership. Let's tell the world the US is writing the next chapter on feminist foreign policy. And I think we have a lot of good ideas we can work with.
Well, the administration has, as you note, leaned in on providing the most equitably placed cabinet and announcements of staff that we've seen from any administration. And so if they're signaling the intent to do the right things. And so I appreciate your suggestions regarding what is necessary to move even further. So we have about only 10 minutes left, believe it or not. And we have a number of questions that have come from our audience. So let's pivot to that very quickly. Oh, and come over to you, Ambassador, because one of the questions that is getting some traction is, how can we make sure the voices of women in developing countries don't get left out of the big discussions, the international discussions?
Yeah, that's one of the very important point that was underlined by Lyric in designing from a government representative point of view, what is a feminist foreign policy. And I think it has been, a slow process, but it's now a sure process that most countries who are adopting a feminist foreign policy do understand that this foreign policy and these policies cannot be designed, conceived, brainstormed, and finalized without the main actors and beneficiaries of these policies. So this translates into several ways of consulting, of course, grassroots organizations, especially in the global South. This also translates into a very practical issue of financing and funding, because what we hear over and over from grassroots organizations, especially from the global South, is that advocacy is very important, language is very important, what we do at the UN Security Council, in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, everything's very important, but they desperately need funding and support on the ground, especially in the context of the pandemic, because many of those feminist organizations, local feminist organizations, are much smaller than the huge development NGOs, that we know of, like Oxfam or CARE, which don't really need our support in order to survive, which is not the case for those small grassroots organizations. So what we've done, following the lead of the Netherlands and also Canada with its Equality Fund in France, is that we announced last year in July our own Feminist Fund. So it's called the Fund to Support Feminist Organizations. Sorry, I didn't have the English translation right at hand. And we launched it also based on the understanding that it's very important to be able to fund and finance directly and support directly these organizations, which are, for some of them, again, at risk of not surviving the pandemic, because sometimes they're really, really small, and sometimes they do not have access to the big philanthropic foundations, to the big networks, to the big connections that they need to. And they're the ones really doing the work on the ground, handling gender-based violence, providing services, sexual and reproductive rights services, and economic services, and so on. So we're trying to kind of narrow the gap between a big state, a big government, and those grassroots organizations.
And I've just been corrected by the organizers of today's panel that because of the importance of this conversation, that we are scheduled to go until the top of the hour. So we do have about 20 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do then is go to Gary, because when we started this conversation, even before the cameras were on, we were talking about your work in both developed and developing countries. How do you ensure that these issues become priorities in developing countries, where too often what you'll hear from policy leaders is we have more important issues to focus on?
I mean, I think, echoing what Lyric said before, I think if we take seriously a feminist foreign policy, we also have to take seriously what we do in the US to redress gender and economic inequalities, and that those are not separable. I think we have to acknowledge the global South that exists within our global North. COVID is perhaps the glaring example before us as we're, in this year of lockdown, that whatever the world crisis is, health, economic, climate, conflict, it affects these crises affect the most vulnerable. It's obvious but necessary to say that. And those are the poorest women and girls in any society. So I do think this conversation, what's going into the gender equality, to the Generation Equality Forum, and what's going into these conversations about a feminist foreign policy, there's no separation to me that we can do this abroad better than we do it at home. If we're to have any integrity and any accountability to feminist principles, we have to do it at both places. It feels to me like we've got to break out of that zero-sum game approach and say we have to do this in rural parts and urban low-income areas in the US and in France, as we have to do this in our support of countries in the global South. And maybe just, as we think about the moment of COVID, I think all of us have, perhaps become tired of the cliche of the opportunity in the crisis. But I do believe we also have to think about that opportunity in the crisis, and to be mindful every day of what it has meant to the lowest income families, to women and girls, whether on the front line as caregivers and healthcare providers or at home. And the opportunity, at least one that we see in this, is how important care has been in the midst of this crisis, and how visible and it has become that we see that the care that is provided in households predominantly by women is how we survive and thrive. And so one of the issues that we think is often forgotten because it's hidden behind doors where it happens is the unequal care burden. And what do we need to do to have policies that say we support all kinds of care, we redress the inequalities in it, we look at the frontline underpaid care workers in any kind of rebuilding that we do coming out of COVID. I think that also needs to be part of how we talk about a feminist foreign policy and how we try to break down kind of this notion between domestic and foreign, that these are the same topics, that we're living in the rural US as we're living in parts of the global South.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your reminder, because as we talk about building back better in response to COVID, the pandemic has increased existing gender inequalities, and we know this. It's estimated that global female job loss would be about 1.8 times higher than male job loss, and even greater in communities of color but even here at home. And one of the issues and priorities that I noted in going back to Blinken's position and his statement of strategic policies for the U.S. is a commitment to U.S. as well as to international. And so when we talk about the need to recognize the challenges and disparities in our own, as you say, global South at home, I like that, Gary. Lyric, how do we develop policies that ensure that it's not just about those over there, but those at home as well?
You asked the people, you asked the experts. So that was something that we did in developing our feminist foreign policy proposal, is we hosted consultations and roundtable discussions with women's rights and human rights groups working in the United States, not working on foreign policy at all. Admittedly, when we invited them, a number were like, why? I don't know anything about foreign policy. Why am I being invited to this consultation? And I would love to tell you that our co-chair of that process, our partner in that process, was Jen Klein, who is now the director of the Gender Policy Council at the White House, and a friend of feminist foreign policy. And so having those groups in the room as we wrote our proposals, we wanted to make sure that we didn't miss anything that they were working on. Sure, we know what we're calling for on gender-based violence, on sexual and reproductive health and rights, et cetera. Guess what? There's a domestic global gag rule that we needed to rescind, as well as a global gag rule. The corollaries have always been similar, but as you mentioned, COVID has laid that bare. Women were 100% of the job losses in December in this country. And in fact, women of color, white women, actually gained. There's just absolutely no way that you can, the proposal doesn't pass the laugh test if those voices aren't represented. And then it's very important when it gets to the specifics of policymaking. If we're asking for a feminist policy council at the White House, what do the domestic women's groups think about that? You know, what worked for you about the White House Council on Women and Girls before? What would you have liked it to do differently? Co-creation was a big part of that. I think everyone, domestic and foreign policy, said, we mostly just got called to the White House to hear updates. We didn't get called to the White House to say, what do we need to be doing better? And so I'm optimistic and hopeful that seeing all the other things that have shifted so far, that's next. And I'll just put a quick plug for the fact that we do have the Commission on the Status of Women starting just a little later this month at the United Nations. And we will have a commission event with most of the governments that Delphine mentioned, Ambassador O mentioned earlier, to hear in more detail about what each of those countries are doing. And then of course, to hear from activists about how we can make it better. I'll put that in the
So as we plan for that Generation Equality Forum, Delphine, you don't mind if I call you Delphine, right? A question has come from our audience that asks, recognizing the UN's huge work to advance gender equality, how were women's groups chosen and which were chosen to be at the table to co-organize the Generation Equality Forum? And previously, the UN required women's group to achieve ECOSOC consultative status that takes significant resources and home state buy-in. The policy has strained which women's groups participate and what kind of policy priorities can get on the international agenda on issues, for example, issues of land rights. Can you comment?
Sure. I don't want to delve too much into the intricacies of our governance system if anybody's interested, but I'm going to answer the question. No, it's actually a good question, because the way that those women's groups and NGOs and CSOs were picked and the way that we're organized, the governance, it might be tedious from the outside, but it's actually very much reflecting the huge shift in mentalities and in the way that we do things when we organize international conference and try to move the needle forward. So to answer your question, there was no requirement for any of these organizations to be sitting at the governance table. So we have what we call the core group, which is composed of representatives of UN Women, France, and Mexico. And then we added a civil society advisory group, which is made up of over 25 CSOs with a very delicate balance when it comes to geographic representation, constituencies, age, and et cetera, et cetera. And what we did is that we decided not to choose them. We decided actually to let civil society decide by themselves who should be representing themselves in a truly democratic manner. So this was coordinated by NGO CSW, which is the largest kind of gathering of NGOs that are registered at the CSW, but much beyond. It's tens of thousands of activists from all over the world. And they put out a call, and then there was a jury and so on. And we governments were hands off from this process, saying it's not for us to decide, to pick and choose who's going to be sitting there, because then they could be conflicts of interest and so on. And so there are 25 organizations, but they actually represent huge networks, local, regional, sub-regional, national, and international, and we have big constituencies. And what we did in addition to this is that we added a fifth seat at the table, which is to represent youth organizations specifically. There was a demand from youth organizations to be represented in addition to civil society, because the youth, and especially the feminist youth, is very vocal these days. And so we had the same process through, we have what we call the youth task force, which is representing hundreds and hundreds of organizations. And every time there's a decision to be made, it's a truly inclusive process, because they go back to the constituencies, they consult, through all possible channels, and then kind of bring their voice back to the table when we have to make a decision.
Catherine, can I just
Sure,
express
please.
very briefly my admiration and appreciation for exactly what Ambassador has just shared. Having been watching this process from the beginning, it wasn't guaranteed from the beginning that civil society would be a part of the governance structure with voting rights. That's often in other elements of advocacy the first thing that goes when in our ass of having veto power, and it didn't here. They went with that. It has definitely slowed down the process, and so I think what is the proverb? If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I think that building pieces like that into the governance and modalities of this work, and having advocates around the world nominate their own as opposed to being anointed in capital, is a real success factor, and one of the things that I think I hope is a model for other similar processes moving forward.
And it's very challenging, I have to say, for governments to be sitting at the same table with CSOs and to be deciding collectively. It's extremely challenging, especially when you have two governments, UN agencies, 25 CSOs, can you imagine? But it's been obviously very rich. And for us, it's very important because this feminist foreign policy and this way of doing things is very much also a manifestation of what our President Macron has called for, which is a multilateralism by deeds and not just by words. So, we talked a lot about how to renew multilateralism, which has been under attack by many countries, many governments. And this is a way also to renew multilateralism by doing things differently when we host an international conference.
Well, having spent so much of my career in the multilateral space, I must ask this question to all of you. Are you concerned about a feminist foreign policy being co-opted or watered down by the multilateral process? And how do you ensure that the goals and objectives remain ambitious and transformational? Let's start with you, Gary.
No, I think that that is always the risk, that revolutionary ideas get watered down and made into softer, less powerful things, to call them that. So where I feel less worried about that, and that has to do a lot with how the Generation Equality Forum is being organized, which is if the voices of young people, if the voices of community-based frontline organizations that represent women at all levels, I think we can build in what we call accountability. So I do think if those are kept central, this is not a checklist. It's not a, hey, and I think if we listen to countries who have had feminist foreign policies in place for a number of years, there's a huge amount of dialogue that goes on constantly. There's a lot of building coalitions around it and rebuilding and bringing new members on. There's a need to train a generation of whether that's diplomatic corps workers who have to get, this is a new way of doing business. It's figuring out the dialogue between the international and your domestic policies. It's acknowledging mistakes. It's figuring out the metrics. So, I think let's acknowledge this is messy organizational politics that we have to, sort of get our hands dirty in. But I suppose I do feel confidence that we can get it right and keep it centered in feminist principles, particularly if we've got young voices at the table who will call out older voices who they feel kind of go back to the previous way of doing things. So I say that as, father of a 20-something daughter who will call me out every day if she if she thinks that I think that I have the answer to an issue. I think it's that kind of accountability at all levels of this, whether at the forum itself and whether in the policy making, that we will get it right.
Ambassador, you're working on this every day. How do you ensure it doesn't get watered down?
Well, I mean, to be more objective, you should ask the CSOs rather than a government representative. I'm not going to be very objective or neutral in answering this question. Again, it's been hugely challenging, organizing the forum, especially with the postponement due to the pandemic. The fact that all of a sudden the entire world is, obsessed about vaccines, about closing borders, about so many issues, and you try to, to be a voice in the desert saying, yes, but gender equality is even more important, even in the time in the pandemic, but it's hard to get everybody's attention. But anyway, no, we try to hold ourselves respectively accountable. So, civil society holds governments accountable. We hold the UN accountable. The UN holds us accountable. And this is truly what working in a collective group in a multi-stakeholder way means. And we also know at the end of the day that the success of the forum, of this enterprise, is also based on our capacity to reflect this multi-stakeholder nature of the forum and of its success or failure. We'll see. But if we don't live up to these expectations, we know that feminist organizations are watching us and they're going to hold us accountable. We cannot achieve everything because we know it's been 25 years, it's been a long time, but especially in the economic and social crisis, we cannot achieve everything. We're going to try to move the needle and be ambitious. But at least in the process, I do think it's unique the way that we're doing things.
So over to you, Lyric, because you're the CSO organizations holding governments accountable.
I'm writing my report card as we speak. I think something that we should we should be clear-eyed about is in the example of the forum. This is intentionally being held outside of the intergovernmental process. We didn't have another Beijing for 26 years because we were not confident that in 2020, we could land in the same place, not even get better on women's rights issues that we did in 1995. The very real and very powerful organizing of the anti-gender ideology opposition, the targeting of women's human rights defenders, the rise of populist strongmen leaders in countries at home and abroad. These are all very real threats to the integrity and protection of this agenda within an intergovernmental system that is still structured the way that enables those voices to dominate. So I think one of the, this is all innovation, right? I mean, according to the Council on Foreign Relations wrote a paper that said, feminist foreign policy is signaling the highest degree of ambition of gender equality in foreign policy. It's okay if you don't end up using the F word, but if you do, be prepared that that means people like me are going to come want to look under the hood and see what you're doing. How is it innovative? How is it ambitious? So the Generation Equality Forum is by design trying to innovate its way outside of the intergovernmental space, say this is going to be a champions only forum. We're going to be ambitious. You can't come to the table if you don't make a commitment. Here's what an ambitious commitment looks like. We're talking, what are your results? 1 year, 5 years, et cetera. How do we can and will innovate our way out of the constraints of the intergovernmental system and see what success looks like when we do it by ourselves. So thank you, Ambassador O, for your leadership on that. And thank you all for your interest and support.
Well, we have 3 minutes left. And on that note of ambition, what would global success look like? From each one of you, give us 30 seconds. Over to you, Gary.
Men doing half the care work and an ending of men's violence against women and men's support for gender equality. We know how to measure those things. We have metrics for those. Yeah, I would go with those in 30 seconds.
Ambassador?
2 answers on a very personal level. The day that all women everywhere in the world will never, ever, ever again have to fear for their safety and security. And a professional answer, if 5 or 10 years from now, we talk about the Generation Equality Forum the way that today we talk about the Beijing conference, then, you know, I could just rest my head and be very content with the work we have done.
Lyric, you have the final word.
For me, I think it is all countries being able to arrive in a place where basic human rights are protected in their domestic and foreign policy, where all voices are equally heard, listened to, included in processes like these, and where we can reimagine a world that centers more on global goods, people, peace, planet, than on so-called national interest, or at least understand that those things are in the national interest.
Well, Dr. Gary Barker, Ambassador Delfino, Professor Lyric Thompson, you have given us much to think about and much hope on what is possible. And I want to thank you for joining us as we celebrate Women's History Month here at the Council, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. These are issues that, fortunately, we've been talking about for 26 years and haven't made the progress that many of us who attended Beijing thought we would make in short order. Now we're talking about how do we avoid going backwards. So I look forward to the outcomes from the upcoming summit and the continued work, Professor Thompson, that you'll have with this administration and Gary with ensuring that we bring the feminist foreign policy home to our communities, as well as to ensuring equal access to women of tools and representation for the goals of developing peace and prosperity in a sustainable way for all. Thank you all for joining us here at the Chicago Council, and please go to our website for future programs. Thank you.